Hello! Welcome back to All Along the Watchtower, the best ever Watchmen retrospective podcast, or at least we aim to be. We are your hosts, Baylor Thornton and Jack Weatherford.
Hello.
We are back this week to talk about chapters 4 through 6 of Original Watchmen. So if you haven't picked up the book and read along with us, please do that.
And if you have read it and you haven't seen the last video, go ahead and watch that before you watch this one, because there's going to be a lot of things in context that relate to that video.
Yes, chapter 4 is one of the big ones. It's possible to call it the best chapter of the whole book. Would you say?
I'm very tempted to say it's the best chapter in the book. Then again, I feel that I have to read the rest of the chapters, but so far, like reading it again after all these years, so far this is my favorite chapter, reading it again.
Yeah, it's very potentially the best one.
Yes. And we're going to go into lots of details why.
Because this is the origin story of Dr. Manhattan and the first time we actually get to understand his powers. Because they kept it a secret for the first 3, but now we actually understand how he perceives time. Do you care to explain it?
It's going to sound insane, but it makes sense when you read the book. So at the beginning of it, hold on, let me get to chapter 4. So
it's basically Slaughterhouse 5. That's how I describe it, if you've read that book.
Yes. If you read the sorry, what were you saying?
Because like in Slaughterhouse 5, he experiences everything at once.
Yes. So basically, Dr. Manhattan will be experiencing time in one specific time period, and at the exact same time, he will be experiencing another period that happened several years, like in the future or in the past, while simultaneously experiencing what's going on in the present.
Yes, everything happening at once. So, with that in mind, it's much easier to understand why he's so disconnected from human beings, because he has forgotten how human beings live their lives.
Yes. All right. Okay. So basically, at the start of this chapter, it picks up immediately where the last one left off, where he's on Mars, and he's looking at a picture of this man and this woman at the fair together. And I put it down in the notes, going back to how he experiences time. He says that in like 12, what was it, 12 seconds? In 12 seconds, he's going to drop the picture, and he keeps counting down the seconds until he drops the picture.
Yeah, so like, because of that, I think he knows when the present is, but he's almost never actually in the present. He's always somewhere else.
Right.
And it's interesting that, well, to be clear, nothing plot-wise, nothing actually happens in this chapter. He's just on Mars, remembering all these things and reliving them.
Right.
Like it's all flashbacks, which you can get away with because it's a comic book, I feel.
Yes.
And it's interesting. It's interesting that nothing in the future really happens here.
No, not really until like the very, very tail end, and even then, that's not much.
All you can really see from the future is the meteor shower.
Yeah, I put that down, how it kind of spoils what happens at the end of the chapter in like the first few panels.
I mean, it's not really a spoiler. It's just how he understands things.
That's true.
And there's a specific reason, we're not going to get into it, but there's a specific reason why he cannot see the future and act upon it.
Right.
At this moment in time, yes. Okay, so let's get into, we already know who Dr. Manhattan is, so let's get into the man himself, John Osterman.
Yes. So at the very first time we see John, before he becomes Dr. Manhattan, he's a watchmaker.
Yes, hence the title of this chapter.
Which I put down as it's kind of an interesting take, seeing how on each, like before each chapter shows something of a clock, like the doomsday clock, and I feel like there's like some metaphor there for like him being a watchmaker, but I'm not quite sure what it is.
It's a motif. Like the clock, the doomsday clock, and the watch. It's like, and watches come back again and again in this chapter. everything here goes back to either two things: watches or bombs. So we see in this opening scene that he wants to be a watchmaker, but his dad instead forced him into atomic physics.
Yes, because he just read in the papers about the Hiroshima bomb.
Yeah, which is kind of what happened to Albert Einstein, I'd say. And I say that, well, sort of, because, he was like this genius, yet they used his intellect to make bombs,
Yeah, that's true.
That's why I feel like that's why he's the quote at the end of this chapter.
Oh yeah, that's true. I never really realized that until now.
Mm-hmm. And we see that his relationship with his dad never repairs. He always blames him for this decision because he never wanted to go into atomic physics, to the point where when he's declared dead, he never tells his dad that he's still alive.
I feel like I find it interesting on the last panel in chapter 113. He's talking about how, again, going back to his relationship with times, he first goes into saying how he's arriving at Princeton. Then he says he's graduated. Now he's talking about he's experiencing graduating all at the same time. It's the scene where his father throws down his watch parts from their apartment.
Right, and even in chapter 1, he mentions the bestiary when he's looking at Gleanos, and we see here that they called at the lab they called the bar the bestiary, which shows that despite how disconnected he is from humanity, he is still very much in touch with his past, a la Hollis and Sally. He's still very nostalgic for that time before, I'd say.
Yes, he is. So anyway, he goes to Princeton, and he comes across this machine where somebody explains that it's a time lock test vault where they try to separate objects from their intrinsic fields and that no radiation gets out of it.
Yeah, and there's a panel of him inside the chamber as foreshadowing.
And that's going to be that's going to play a big part in what happens later on in this chapter.
Yeah, and at the bar, the bestiary, he meets his first love, Janie Slater. And it's interesting that she says, "You're the new guy replacing Hank Meadows. Hank died last fall, some kind of tumor." Why is it that these three characters, Hank Meadows, Janie Slater, and Wally Weaver, all get cancer?
I don't know. At least you don't know at this part of the book.
Yeah, but it's suspicious because even before Manhattan and period industries, there's this very clear link between cancer and these atomic scientists.
At the end of chapter 115, they already reveal that Janie and John they break up eventually.
We're making love after an argument, our tenderness in direct proportion to its violence.
Right.
Really, nothing's a spoiler. He tells you directly this isn't going to last.
Mm-hmm.
And we already know from chapter 3. Yeah.
Right. So then we go to the next part where the picture from earlier, it's the scene where they actually take the picture.
And notice in the background of these panels, you see the balloon flying away.
Right.
Before we see the kid up front losing it.
Yeah, I agree.
And at this carnival, a fat man steps on the watch. Notice how the fat man was one of the code names for the atomic bomb.
I see. I get that. That's another thing I didn't really realize. So after that scene, we get to the part where John
fixes her watch.
Right.
And at the bar, he thinks he left it in the
machine from earlier.
In the machine. Turns out he didn't. It was in his pocket the whole time.
And then the door closes behind him.
Yes. And he's trapped inside as it's doing a test, and he cannot open the door because it's a safety feature.
Right.
he dies due to a safety feature, which I think is a nod to Doctor Strangelove.
Yeah.
Because in that movie, nuclear Armageddon happens because of a safety protocol.
So like all the scientists show up to see John, and the head one, and the head and Dr. Glass, who's like the head scientist there, explains that this afternoon's experiment is revolving the intrinsic field from concrete block 15. And John goes, I ask him what happened to the other 14, and he tells me. I find it interesting how they don't like show him telling that, but even without that, you kind of get the idea that you kind of get the idea of like what's coming.
So then there's the big panel of John Osterman disintegrating, this famous shot right here,
which is still horrifying. That's probably still one of the scariest panels I've seen in a comic, most likely.
Oh yeah, total body horror.
Yeah. In the movie, they like replicate that shot, and even I feel like in the movie it doesn't have near the impact as it does in the book.
I mean, yeah, it's scary because it's a still image, not a thing that only happens for a few seconds.
I agree. That happens. Everybody thinks John is dead, and then November, a circulatory nervous system just appears out of nowhere, followed by a muscular system. Yeah, this is John basically like reforming his body.
Yeah, first power he gains is how to rebuild himself.
And that finally leads to the scene on November 22nd in the cafeteria where John comes back and he looks like Dr. Manhattan.
Yep, I have the same birthday as Dr. Manhattan.
Yes, you do. Your birthday is also November 22nd. We get to the scene where it's Christmas, and Janie and Dr. Manhattan are spending Christmas together, and Janie's scared because they're basically saying he's God.
Wait, before that, there's a scene where he goes, all gold comes from supernovas.
Oh, yeah.
To me, that's foreshadowing of like his closed-mindedness, because right now he's very direct with his associations, like only like very absolute, like only this can come from this.
Right.
Like he's not yet receptive to the idea of a thermodynamic miracle, which he later describes as turning air into gold.
Mm-hmm.
He's not, so this shows that he's not yet receptive to that idea, but he will be.
Right. So now going back to the Christmas scene where Janie starts telling John that she's scared because now they're basically saying he's a walking god.
Yes, and
John basically says, "I don't think there's a god," which again I think also shows his closed-mindedness starting to form.
Yeah, and how callous he is because he doesn't understand like human boundaries and sensitivity.
No, because again, like we've mentioned this before, but he's basically a totally like different person, like completely reborn. So it makes sense why he still like has like narrow like views on things.
Yes.
Because from the very beginning, when you first see John, you know this is not the same person as Dr. Manhattan. He's a completely different person.
I mean, look, there's remnants of John still in here, but it's taking a long time to get to really like tap into that human nature. Right. To me, that's his mark in this book. Try to tap into that again, and he's not there yet.
No, which I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah. And also at this scene, he straight up says he lies to Janie, as he said, I'll always want you.
Which is also mentioned here, like as I lie, I hear her shouting at me in 1963, sobbing in 1966. So they reveal it again.
Yep, he's just not a very sensitive guy right now.
No, he's not. And in some of those ways, just way of his insensitivity kind of makes him comes across as. I mean, I get why he's like that, but sometimes just his behavior he just comes across as very just not that likable. Which again, there's not a lot of likable people in this book.
I mean, yeah, not at this point. He's also at the point where he just fries Vietnamese people with lasers from his hands, and it doesn't even register him.
Right.
Yeah.
But then we get to the scene where he's doing photo shoots, and he makes the symbol on his forehead with the circle and the two dots,
which is a hydrogen atom, as he says.
Right.
which makes sense because everybody basically considers him a walking, talking hydrogen bomb.
That's part of the reason why they named him Dr. Manhattan, because of the Manhattan Project.
So then we see on television that they're basically turning him into this weapon. Like he
Yeah.
basically has no say. He basically has no say in it. He's just the future of the military.
Right.
And on the other side, he's basically the new hooded justice as he influences a whole new wave of costumed vigilantes.
Right. It kind of reminds me earlier. It kind of reminds me earlier in It's like earlier. I'm going back to like when we read Under the Hood last time. Hollis Mason basically said Dr. Manhattan was like the big new dawn of the superhero.
Yeah, which lines up timeline-wise with the real comic book history, as the Minutemen is the Golden Age and the Crime Busters are the Silver Age.
Right.
Because a lot of this book is about comic book history, and we'll get into that with the Black Freighter stuff.
Yeah, I put in during this part where they're showing the television broadcast, they interview Captain Metropolis, and I put down the fact that he almost looks nervous about the fact that Dr. Manhattan is a thing.
Oh yeah, we're pleased, obviously. Very pleased.
Yeah, he's like, oh poop, I'm out of a job. Like, he's basically put all those other heroes like to shame. He makes them useless now.
Yeah, now that he actually has powers.
Right.
So then we see that he's at this charity event.
Oh, before that, I want to talk about
yeah.
Janie and Dr. Manhattan talking about, like, can you imagine you arrived and Dr. Manhattan's like, have I? Somehow I feel like I've been here all the time.
Because at that point, yeah, he kind of has.
He has.
Because even in the 60s, he will have experienced all this other crap that's happened to him. Okay, so at this charity event, we see him amongst all these other costume heroes, and of course they look like chumps next to him.
Yeah, with their goofy costumes.
Yeah, and he's even here. He only has a preference for Vite.
Yeah, which I put down. I found that interesting. How Vite is the only one that really speaks to him.
Yeah.
Also, I put in the background that the comedian and Captain Metropolis are arguing, which might be foreshadowing to the Crime Buster scene.
Oh, certainly. And then in the next panel, Dr. Manhattan is infiltrating Moloch's vice den by just blowing people's fucking heads off.
Yeah, and I found it interesting because the last line of that panel just says, "The mortality of my activities escapes me."
Morality, yeah.
Morality.
Because what could they possibly be doing at these nightclubs that's so bad? This is probably just a place where you go see strippers and do cocaine. Like, that's not any place that's not any, like, quote unquote vice that's worth getting anyone killed.
But I know, I just pointed out how that line is in there next to the panel of him just blowing up a guy's head. Again, because kind of shows just how almost sociopathic he is.
Yeah, and it's just such a...
Like, it's almost scary.
Yeah, I'm just saying this is such a bullshit job. Like, what's the point of infiltrating
It is. And then the very next panel, it's him meeting John F. Kennedy, and he says, "Kennedy is shaking my hand, asking what it's like to be a superhero. Tell him he should know," and he nods, laughing.
Yeah, and it also says that he fails to prevent that assassination.
So again, it's still weird how he knows the future, but he can't really do anything in the moment.
Yeah, he doesn't feel like interfering.
Right.
Largely because, I mean, we don't know this yet, but in Chapter 9, it's hinted that the comedian killed JFK as an inside job.
We get to the scene where he's at Hollis Mason's retirement party, which is the first night owl.
And to his dismay, he discovers that Manhattan is engineering a whole new wave of electric cars, since Manhattan now can produce enough lithium for it.
Right. Which again, at the beginning of the podcast, we talked about how in this universe there's now electric cars, and now we know the reason for that is because of Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah, his arrival changes everything: technology, transportation, fashion, everything.
Right. He basically ushers in like a whole new like era of just society. It's his arrival that is one of the reasons that sets off this entire alternate reality.
Yeah, if it was just guys in superhero costumes, it would be largely the same, but no, Manhattan's existence is what makes it so radically different from our own. And it's just interesting that, like, again, with this whole, like, Silver Age beating out the Golden Age, like, it just shows that even in cars, Hollis Mason's topped. Because we see in the sign at his place, obsolete models a specialty.
Right. So then afterwards, we get to the scene with the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Janie Slater and a lot, just like Lori and someone else we'll talk about when we get to the TV show, all three of them are so freaked out by by the way he perceives time. That is like the main thing that causes conflict with these relationships.
Right.
I mean, I would be too, because it is weird.
It's extremely weird. So after that, we get to the Crime Busters scene from earlier.
Yeah, and I mentioned this last time because you could see in the background what's happening now, but we see full front that at this meeting, his main interest is Lori.
Right. In that same after the Crime Busters, they show the panel of at least one of the Dr. Manhattans making love to Lori, like in chapter 3.
Yes.
So we now he's in love. So now we know that he's gonna leave Janie, and now we're gonna see that he falls in love with Lori, and that's the reason why they're gonna split up.
Yeah, and on the next page, it's the left panels are all him with Lori, and the right are all with him with Janie.
Right.
And it's such a radically different scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and specifically because he doesn't age.
No, he
It's
doesn't.
specifically because Dr. Manhattan is not aging along with Janie, so he's not attracted to her anymore. And it just again shows that he's having a hard time connecting to anybody.
Right. And then afterwards, he moves in with Lori, and immediately after that, Nixon asks him to go to Vietnam.
Which again is just like chapter 2, is juxtaposing these very authoritative positions of government with these really amoral, terrible guys, which just shows how little faith Alan Moore has in these institutions.
Right. And after they mentioned that Nixon and told Manhattan going to Vietnam, it says, later in November, I'm told that Wally Weaver has died of cancer, age 34. And then after that, he's in Vietnam and he's being introduced to the comedian. And notice in that scene that the comedian is with that Vietnamese woman who he shoots in chapter 2. So again, much like chapter 2, now we get like what Dr. Manhattan like really thinks about the comedian.
Yeah.
I like coming to understand Vietnam and what it implies about the human condition. I also realized that few humans would permit themselves such an understanding. Blake's different. He understands perfectly, and he doesn't care.
Yeah, I feel like they have that similarity at this point because Manhattan is also having a hard time caring.
People who like were in Vietnam kind of grew to have that kind of hard time connecting. Like, if you've seen Apocalypse Now, it's kind of the same thing with Kurtz. So the next panel shows Dr. Manhattan in Vietnam, and he's the size of a skyscraper.
Yeah, like in this universe, the Vietnam War wasn't even close. Just Dr. Manhattan.
No, like we won by a long shot.
Yeah, Dr. Manhattan just massacred the whole thing. Kind of gets to this overall point that Alan Moore is saying about violence, because later he also mentions that the comedian handles the Iranian hostage crisis, presumably with brute force in the same way. So I feel like what he's saying about violence is that, like, superheroism in these like governmental positions, he's saying like, sure, it can fix these one-off issues, but all it's doing is just stockpiling all of these aggressions onto each other. And because of that, like, this universe is much closer to nuclear Armageddon than we ever were.
He mentions the scene where the comedian kills the Vietnamese woman.
Yeah, and it's interesting how Manhattan is shocked that this happened.
even though he knows it's going to happen.
Not even that, just specifically this murder, even though he's killed thousands of people at this point.
That's true.
Yeah, it's interesting that this one manages to rock his moral conscience. So then there's a scene in Antarctica where we first see Veidt's retreat
Yeah.
and his kitty Bubastis.
Right.
And I think it's interesting how Manhattan describes her as his beautiful, monstrous cat, and Lori describes her as with "I hadn't realized that eugenics was so advanced now." Why use the word eugenics in this case when that's a word we correctly associate with Nazi practices? I think the word eugenics in this case is to show that Veidt's creations do not always have aren't always bound in morality. As Manhattan even asks him if scientists are limited by their consciences, and Veidt says, "Let's hope so."
And he's outside the White House with protesters. And this is the first, and basically, they're all protesting, and he just teleports them all away.
Yeah, and he says that two of them have got heart attacks because of it. But he justifies it by saying that the protest would have been worse. I don't understand how he knows that, though.
Again, it's just kind of his closed-mindedness where he says, like, well, these have heart attacks, but on the other hand, they could have suffered more from this riot, so I did a good job.
Right, no, I don't. I think he's just justifying that because he thinks that protesting the government is bad since he's a government agent.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, after that scene, we finally get to the Keene Act with, like, which outlaws masked superheroes.
Yes.
For the exception of Dr. Manhattan and the comedian, because they both work for the government.
Yes.
Which I found that interesting. How all these others, like, we'll ban these guys, but these two they can keep because they work for us. So they're exempt.
Right. Again, it just shows how little faith Alan Moore is having in these institutions.
Right. And then we get to the scene which you talked about where the comedian, like, saves the Iran hostage crisis.
Yeah, presumably by shooting them because he's holding a gun in this shot.
Right.
Because in real life, that was a huge bureaucratic shit show.
It was.
But we managed to correct me on this, but I believe we managed to get out of it by killing nobody. So, what do you think is worse? Negotiations that take longer or violence that's quick? Just like the Vietnam War, like, sure, like the superheroism fixed this one-off scenario, but it's clearly not making the world a better place since all of these aggressions are piling onto each other and leading to possible nuclear devastation.
Right.
Because that never happened in real life.
No, it didn't. It didn't.
Yeah, like diplomacy saved the day at the end, while that's clearly not an option here.
No. So after the Keene Act, it talks about how Lori, like, retires from being a superhero, and it mentions that her mother is more disappointed than she is. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, of her mom kind of still living in the past. And they also mention how Rorschach is, like, Rorschach is still doing his thing. It says he expresses his feelings towards compulsory retirement in a note left outside the police headquarters along with a dead multiple rapists. And on the note, it just says never.
I think it's interesting how he says blots of gray slide along the summer sidewalks because they're shadows of the overhead airships.
Right.
Like, we see that those have been mass produced to the point where, like, these blimps are even advertising like diners.
Right, which I put in how, like, there's a big elephant blimp advertising, like, Gunga Diner in Chapter 5.
Yeah, that's clearly a Manhattan technology. And also I put down that on the Time magazine, there's that cover of the watch in the Hiroshima blast.
Yeah.
Which, again, goes back to the motifs of watches and bombs. Those are, like, the two things that define this character.
Exactly. I talk about like commemorating Hiroshima Week. Usually it's
Yeah.
just, which I find interesting. Does that mean like in this, they kind of consider it a holiday in this universe?
I don't know, because for a while we thought that was a good thing.
Yeah. And nowadays we kind of see it as a, that's the thing about Hiroshima. It was it was either like invade and like lose more Americans or just drop the bomb. So it was kind of a difficult decision because no, I don't think they really want to do either.
Right. My main thing is why'd they have to drop it twice?
Intimidation, I guess.
It's ridiculous.
I mean, yeah. There's some things in hindsight that you can look back and think, do we really need to do that? Like again, Vietnam.
Or
Did
the
we really
Japanese
need?
camps.
Yeah, like did we really need to get involved in that?
It's easier to criticize these things in hindsight, yeah.
Yeah, totally, totally. So we go through all the parts that we mentioned earlier. How Lloyd leaves him. He's at the talk show. He goes to the old bar, which is all broken down, and then we get back to him on Mars.
With the classic line, I'm tired of this world, these people, I'm tired of being caught in the tangle of their lives. So, which explains why he's secluded himself to Mars to build his fortress, which notice how it all looks like
Right.
cogs.
It does.
Yes.
And also, we see another one of his powers, which is that he can be able to levitate. And I find it interesting how while he's building the clock, the line, without me, things would have been different. If the fat man hadn't crushed the watch, if I hadn't left it in the test chamber, am I to blame then? Or the fat man? Or the father for choosing my career? Which of us is responsible? Who makes the world? I've mentioned this a couple times to my family, but that goes to one thing. Like, one thing that I feel like one thing that I've been interested about recently is the idea of tempting fate. And I was talking about this with my dad. It's like, if one thing happens, it's kind of like this quote, guys, it goes into both like tempting fate or the butterfly effect. Like, if something happens different, what that means, like the outcome of like everything become like different in another way. It's the same thing. Like each time a butterfly flaps its wings, like something changes.
Right. It's all a matter of specific events colliding with each other.
Right, which I found that interesting because I'm interested in that concept, and that quote plays a lot into it.
Yes. The only thing I want to say about the in-universe text by Milton Glass, who is the guy who said the Superman exists and he is American, in this in-universe
Mm-hmm.
like pamphlet, this excerpt, this essay, he goes, "What I meant to say was God exists and he is American. If that statement starts to chill
Right.
you, then don't be alarmed. It only indicates you are still sane," which shows that people aren't even really registering him as like this superhero, like public figure, just like this omnipotent being. And this also goes into what I've been saying earlier about how he's not how like all these like solutions to issues aren't really solutions. They're only creating bigger problems because
Mm-hmm.
in this essay, this professor argues that Manhattan is not here to save the world, he's here to destroy it.
We are all of us living in the shadow of Manhattan is what it ends with. But yeah, again, like it is funny reading all this now because as I mentioned in the last podcast, these things I would always flip over because I wanted to get to the main story. But reading these now, it just gets a whole new outlook on the story in general.
Also, like convinced with nuclear annihilation. That's not wrong at this point because it's only getting more dire as the situation goes on. Yeah, to the point in chapter 6, they talk about placing family members in garbage sacks outside for collection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's disturbing, obviously.
Right, it is.
Okay. So yeah, chapter 4, great one.
Yeah, fantastic chapter. Again, easily one of the best ones in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads us into chapter 5.
Okay. First thing I want to say about chapter 5 is the title. And fearful
symmetry.
fearful symmetry, which comes from the poem The Tiger. which I think is an absolutely crucial point of this book, because this book is absolutely about fearful symmetry.
Definitely.
It's not just like in universe with Rorschach's mask, like it's absolutely just in the functions of the book. It's all about how many times how can we have symmetrical plot lines or images.
Right. Which I noticed, like, in the beginning of this chapter, they do the same effect as they do in chapter 2 when the comedian visits Moloch, how they, each panel is like a different with the light flashing on and off.
Yeah, and it looks amazing with the same 9 panel 5-4 grid.
Right.
And I like to point out that the sign here looks identical to a skull and crossbones, which
Right.
shows that the Black Freighter subplot is really starting to invade and juxtapose with the main plot.
Definitely. So we see Moloch walking back to his apartment, and while he's walking, we see a newspaper that says Russians invade Afghanistan.
Just feels like more and more complications are going on.
Right. So basically, he goes home. He suspects somebody is at his house, so he gets a gun and moves around. Then he goes to his fridge. Rorschach's jacket is there, and he sees a note that says "Behind you." And again, it's one of those brilliant panels that's done with barely any dialogue. They just let the picture speak for itself.
Yeah,
Yet even though there's like no sound, you can just like perfectly imagine it. Again, I'd like to also point out how he checks the fridge first because the first time he runs into Rorschach, he's in the fridge.
yeah. Now he's not. He knows how to
Right.
switch it up.
hmm But I found that interesting how he looks in the fridge like after he hears a noise because he remembers that first encounter.
So then Rorschach interrogates this guy by
Putting him in the fridge.
yeah, by saying cool down and tough break, which further shows his sense of humor
Yeah. I just put in my notes, Rorschach appears to be obsessed with fridges.
a little bit. And just brute force on this guy for just be like really violent interrogations just because he doesn't sound quote unquote convincing enough.
Right. Because he thinks he has something to do with Dr. Manhattan leaving the planet.
Yeah, just because he's obsessed with the idea of heroes and villains when he's really just some guy living alone in his pizza box filled apartment.
Yeah, he's just living a normal life now.
Yeah, sad, lonely life too. Just rotting away
Yeah.
from cancer.
So Moloch tells him he doesn't know who it is. He lets him go. And I like to point out the last thing also points out of one of Rorschach's sense of humor for sorry about mess, can make omelet without breaking few eggs.
And he's obsessed with the idea of Moloch getting a gun license, even though Rorschach can just beat someone up whenever he wants. Shows that another hypocrisy in his morals.
And so we go into another journal entry again, and also going back to what we mentioned earlier about his journals, we get some more instances of Rorschach's pretentiousness, where he says, walked home past trash cans stuffed with rumors of war, weighing factors, bodies, motives, waiting for a flash of enlightenment in all this blood and thunder.
I mean, I don't think he's wrong in this case because nuclear paranoia is definitely taking a toll, especially in this next scene here where we find out about this
And
murder suicide.
yeah, so basically in this next scene, it's the two policemen from when they were investigating Edward Blake's death, and they're investigating a dad who murdered both of his children for fear that the Russians were going to nuke them, and then killed himself, all
Yes.
while the wife was watching the entire time.
Yeah, and notice how like the posters are all like this really like Zen stuff. Yeah, like all this like really quote unquote peaceful stuff. Yet he went mad and did murder suicide. And I like to point out that the blood splatter on this poster is exactly like the badge from earlier.
Yes, as we mentioned from the first episode, that comes back a lot.
And at the end of this segment, it purposely transitioned to like this pyramid logo, which shows that like this pyramid company definitely has blood on his hands.
I like to also point out, just as a fun thing, like I forgot that this part was even in the book because I haven't read it in a while. I forgot that the scene was in it.
And I'd like to say that unlike the rape scene, which was very irresponsible and just ineffective and how it showed everything. This is disturbing because we see none of it. I think this is a much more effective like shock scene than the rape scene because it's all very out of
Which is
frame.
again, yeah. Sometimes the most disturbing things are the things you don't show. So then we go back to the newspaper scene and the pirate comic.
Yeah, and I think it really starts to take hold in this chapter.
Because I definitely saw a lot of kind of visual cues and kind of textual irony throughout between the comic and what's happening in the scene.
Yeah, like the transition between the pirate guy eating the seagull to Dan eating a chicken wing.
But I like to mention at the bottom left panel of 152, the pirate comic says, "I attempt to banish this repulsive notion," while the guy owning the newsstand's just like, it'll never happen. Wonder what's delaying the new frontiersman.
Yeah, denial is very much a part of this chapter because multiple people go that nobody's crazy enough to start this war, which is that an intelligent observation or is it just denial?
It could be either. I think it could be either. Much like a lot of things in this book, it's just open to the reader's interpretation.
Yeah, because nobody knows when the bomb's going to drop. It could never drop, or it could drop tomorrow or today. So there's really no right or wrong way to take
Which
it.
Which is what a lot of people were thinking, like not just in the 80s, but starting in the 50s as well, for the past 30 years.
Yeah, this was an omnipotent fear for decades.
So anyway, we get to the scene of Dan and Loy eating at the diner.
Yeah, and this budding romance between them. Because we now see that Lori's moving in with Dan.
Yeah, since she was just evicted from Manhattan's apartment from like chapter 3, since that place is now under quarantine. So then the next scene is interesting. We get like a point of view of some guy who is revealed as Rorschach because he has the mask, but we don't know who it is.
All these point of view scenes with him are really cool.
Also, I'd like to point out on 155, there's a panel that says, "On way out of room, med landlady usual complaints by our hygiene and rent. There were purple bite marks on her fat white neck, fresh ones." And then he puts, "She reminds me of my mother."
Yeah, we'll get into
chapter. We'll talk about what that means.
Get into his slut shaming going on, but his abusive mom is why he hates sex workers. And this scene also has the first not top silhouette of the couple caressing each other. That's a motif that we'll see again and again later on. Him saying, possibly indulging in sexual foreplay, don't like it, makes doorway look haunted. It just comes to show that sex is the one really afraid of.
Also, you talked about the idea of like slut shaming, which I feel like that also goes in the panel where he sees Dan and Loy leaving the diner. He says, "An affair, perhaps? Did Loy engineer Dr. Manhattan's exile to make room for Rydberg? Also, she hated comedian. Must investigate further."
Yeah, he hates women. If he can blame this on a woman, that would make his day.
Yeah, so like on this scene, we see that he's not only... Like earlier, we found out he's possibly homophobic. In this scene, now we realize he's also sexist.
Oh, he was already sexist, but this is very much like very much a open indicator of that. And also, what I think is great is this bottom row where he takes a question mark into this napkin. If you're familiar with this history, that you know that Rorschach is directly based off the question. So it's no coincidence that he takes a question blot and squishes it into a Rorschach blot.
And also in that scene, the gang members are graffitiing another silhouette graffiti.
Yeah, we see that this is the Not Tops doing. We also see that that he gets all of his information from the garbage. How much worthwhile stuff do you think he actually finds from this trash can?
Probably not much because it's garbage.
Yeah, just interesting how
I think there's not a lot of worthwhile stuff in the garbage.
Yeah, it's interesting how that's his main looking place for evidence.
So anyway, they go back to the newspaper scene and the Tales from the Black Freighter, and it goes into another one of those like textual similarities where the comic says, "I'd swallowed too much bird flesh, I'd swallowed too much horror," while the guy owning the newsstand's like, "I mean, World War III is a nightmare. The only people who can even think about it or the arm companies.
Because
Again,
we know,
he's also trying to swallow the horror too.
yeah, we know that this guy all day he looks at the front pages and sees nothing but bad news.
Right.
And I love this joke right here. Watch the financial pages. Those guys going to make a killing while the pirate guy is talking about these seagull scavengers. Shows that like the Wall Street executives are all just fucking bottom feeders.
Also going back to news vendors understand they get to see the whole picture. While lighthearted, I gaze into the inverted world beneath, where drowned ghosts circled. A madman with blood-caked lips gazed back at me.
Yeah, it shows how much this guy is seeing. Yeah, and how it all how just the pirate metaphor really makes it shine. I feel.
Definitely.
Yeah, it definitely like shows the intensity of the situation.
So then we get back to Adrian Veidt as he's about to like release a new toy line. Again, sellout.
Yeah, both this toy line and how tacky his high-rise like skyscraper looks.
Right.
Like it looks like a mix between King Tut's tomb and Trump Tower.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, it just shows that despite being such like a progressive-minded guy, he's still very much a product of capitalism and indulges in all that bullshit.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So in this scene, we actually see somebody trying to kill him.
Wait, before that, I want to talk about like the Egyptian stuff that he mentions because unlike his secretary or assistant or whatever, Veidt does not view death as really that bad of a thing because he thinks it's like this spiritual journey, like the next step.
Yeah, like the afterlife.
Yeah, which is very different from really anyone else. Just shows how skewed his views are.
Right.
That's gonna go back. So yes, there's this assassination scene, and
but I put down how like great this like whole like section is like drawn.
Yeah, perfect, fearful symmetry. This is one of the best examples of the whole book.
Right. It's like 3 panels to the left and the right, and one big one in the middle connecting them all.
Yeah, it just shows how good this can look when you're very strict with the paneling.
Right.
It just opens up all these possibilities when you impose those limitations on yourself. So then we see this guy killed himself. Like, I can't get any answers out of him because he has a suicide pill under his tongue.
Right. A cyanide pill. Then we go back to another scene of the black freighter in the newspaper comic, which so far, this is the most they've shown of either of these two things in the book. Showing both of those back to back is another good example of the title, Fearful Symmetry.
Yeah, it all goes back to the 5-4 grid, like the alternating stuff going on. Because despite only a few pages where you see the comic book in full, and then I think that's important because like the story of the Black Freighter isn't really the interesting thing about it. It's how it all connects to everything else.
Again, going back to the textual irony from the Black Freighter in this, at one point the guys running the stand is talking about, I bet there's all kind of stuff we never notice, all while the pirate's talking about how he thinks he sees boats, and the newspaper guy says until it's too late, and the pirate's like, no, not boats, fins.
Right. Every single panel of this has great textual irony going on. It's important to read for that.
And also on the bottom middle panel of on page 161, we see the guy with the end is nigh sign leading over a dumpster.
Yes. Okay, so we get another POV scene of Rorschach.
And he's by a dumpster.
We see more world building with like the knot tops on the Katie drug that he talks about, the KT-28s. And the Gunga Diner blimp we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's in the shape of an elephant.
Which makes sense because Indian food is always huge in New York City.
It is.
Yeah, makes sense. That's why that would be one of the that would be big enough to like advertise with a blimp. And
I find it interesting how like after he puts his stuff on, he says approach disturbance and attempted rape / mugging / both. Cleared throat, the man turned and there was something rewarding in his eyes. Sometimes the night is generous to me. which again
Yeah.
illustrates the fact that he wants to do this.
Yeah, he's very much like he very much like gets off on this like violence and all this stuff. And I think it's interesting how he put all this stuff next to a risque nostalgia ad. So like despite his fear of sex, he's still kind of drawn to it and
Right.
uses his violence to quote escape fear, weakness, or lust.
So after that, we just get a short scene of Dan and Lori getting ready for bed.
Yeah, and poor Dan has to stay in bed alone.
Right.
Baby steps, buddy, baby steps.
You'll get there. You haven't lost your training wheels yet.
Nope.
So then we get like the most of the Black Freighter comic, yeah, when it's him dealing with the sharks.
Yeah. And jumping ahead real quick with the tip that the police guys get for Rorschach is raw shark. That's no coincidence.
Oh my gosh, I didn't notice that. Again,
Yep.
there's so many things I don't notice until like there's like a lot of clever things you never notice unless someone just says it straight up to your face.
Yeah, you have to have an eye for it.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Also, I like to point out in this scene how while he's closing to the newspaper shop, a woman comes up and wants to hold up a poster that says "Gay Woman Against Rape." I was looking at this, and by the way the newspaper man like puts it, I don't know if this is supposed to. I don't know if Alamo was supposed to be jabbing at this kind of thing or no.
I believe he's like calling out the homophobia because like there's no reason why this can't be advertised.
Yeah. I mean, I get that, but there's a part of me that kind of thinks like it's just a jab at like just kind of just these kind of movements and how that's what knows like maybe this is Alan Moore's kind of poke at that.
I don't know. He's an extremely leftist guy, like, to the point where he's an anarchist.
So after that scene in the newspaper, we get the police getting the tip off about Rorschach, which you mentioned earlier is Rorschach.
Yep. And it shows that this whole thing was an inside job. Because when he sees Moloch, he's dead. He's getting
framed. He's being shot. He's shot in the forehead.
Yep.
Also, I'd like to point out the scene of Rorschach coming to his apartment is parallel to the opening panels of Chapter 5.
Yeah, exactly the same. Fearful symmetry.
Exactly.
And this...
So the police come, he realizes it's a trap.
And it's a very tense scene. Because
totally.
It's very brief, but it just shows how good Rorschach is like at this stuff. He's very scrappy and resourceful because he just takes pepper, his grappling gun, and hairspray and a lighter and uses all those things as weapons.
Also, if you look closely when he gets the hairspray, it's Vibrand.
Oh yeah, of course it is.
So for the most part of this escape, he's almost successful.
Yeah, but it's inevitable. He's going to lose.
Right.
Still very one-sided. Like he was fucked.
And then we get to the big reveal.
He's the homeless guy.
Yeah, it's the homeless guy from that was holding up the sign for the end is nigh.
It's not really a plot twist because they foreshadowed it so many times, but it is kind of incredible how they managed to technically keep it a secret for almost half the book.
Oh, totally. And it ends on and Chapter 5 ends on the exact same shot as the opening of Chapter 5.
Yep, skull and crossbones.
Beautiful symmetry. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't get the chance to like take notes on the man on Treasure Island Treasury of Comics part, so I'll let you go into that.
I did. There's a few interesting things I want to say about it because...
Well, I'll let you take over this one.
Okay. So the first part of it goes into EC pirates getting investigated by Hoover, which is the thing that actually happened to the EC horror comics. Like Hoover thought they were this menace to society because of its violent images when they're just really goofy comics.
Right.
Yeah, so much like with the Golden Silver Age stuff and the Under the Hood, this is used as like a vehicle to talk about comics as a whole. And this is the other thing I want to get into. This is also where we are introduced to the writer Max Shea, who I think is a stand-in for Alan Moore because
Why do you think?
just
I was saying, why do you think that?
the way he describes his work, this article describes Alex Shea's work. Like he's like it goes as far to say that his early stuff was effective yet cliche, which is how Moore feels about a lot of his work with DC, a lot of The Killing Joke.
Mm-hmm.
And it predicts that Max Shea's later work will be controversial and downright pornographic,
Mm-hmm.
which also happened with Moore's books like Lost Girls, which is he even admitted was an exercise in pornography.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think this is very much a stand-in for Moore, how like he's like this genius writer, like building this guy up. And it's important because it's already hinted that this guy is lost, like vanished.
Right.
And we'd later see him on the island. We'll get into that later.
Well, the only thing I'll say about Chapter 5 is that, again, that whole fearful symmetry thing is due because there's a lot of repeated images and like textual irony throughout the entire thing, and it does a really good job at really literally being its title.
Yeah, the whole book especially, but I'm glad they really hammered it in for that chapter because it just gives you the right lens to view this whole thing. So, chapter 6. This is another big one. Rorschach's origin story.
Yeah, we get to find out about Rorschach, who in this we find out his name is actually Walter Kovacs.
Yep. And I'll just say it. It's a good chapter, but I think it's the weakest of the whole book.
I'll be interested why, because I feel like this is also a good chapter. Mostly because of the doctor's like insight on everything.
Oh, the doctor stuff is why it works. Like I'm glad Moore decided to have the point of view, like the audience surrogate, be this psychologist guy, Dr. Malcolm Long.
Yeah.
Because like the psychology of it and how he's been affected by these encounters with Rorschach are really the bread and butter of this whole chapter.
Yeah, we will get into this again in the movie, but when you watch the movie, and we'll get into this talk on the movie. This doctor character, who's the best part of chapter 6, he's barely a thing in the movie.
Well, yeah, there's no way they could have fit him in. Because like it's just like a brief, like 5-minute scene in the movie, while it's like this whole chapter in the book just shows the limitations of turning this into a film.
It is kind of funny when I first saw like what Walter Kovacs looked like, especially in this. After like seeing like Rorschach with the whole like scraggly stuff and just being this was not the first like face I expected like Rorschach to be. When I see Kovacs, I don't really think of a guy who's like this badass kind of superhero thing. I expected someone who looked a lot tougher.
Yeah, he's a runt. He's very scrappy.
Right. To the point he definitely is tough, and we'll get to that. But at first glance, he just seems like kind of this scrawny wimp.
Yeah, to the point where he wears platform shoes.
Right. So again, I find it interesting how the first time we see the doctor and Kovacs, they're taking a Rorschach test.
And Rorschach lies about it.
Yeah. And also we see a dog with its head split open, which that's nice. Also, I just love the lighting, like the point of view shots of Kovacs, just making him just seem like this very like, again, he's scrawny, but with the light and stuff, it's so intimidating, just the way he just kind of stares back at the reader.
Yeah. And at this point, the Malcolm Long is like terribly naive. He has no idea what he's getting into. He's smiling and optimistic, and he's in for a world of hurt.
Because again, he's lying about these answers, so he's thinking, "Oh, Rorschach's fine. This is going to go along easily."
Nope.
And now all leads into like the first glimpse of Rorschach's past, where his mom is a prostitute.
And here's the silhouette motif again on the card and in the shadows. I don't know. This scene is just so edgy to me. Like the rape, similar to the rape scene. It just feels like, how many buzzwords can we fit into this one scene just because we can?
Yeah, that whole scene I feel like was like one of the hardest to read so far, in my opinion. I mean, it's very difficult to read.
I thought it was silly almost. This sticks along slut shaming, ableism by calling the kid a retard, and
Hmm.
stigmatizes abortion by saying, "I should have had that abortion." Like, it's
Yeah.
like how many more buzzwords can you possibly fit in? It's like it feels like reading 4chan or some shit.
I see that. So after that interrogation scene, it goes to him being walking back to his cell, and I thought it was really interesting how all of the speech bubbles intersect with each other to like symbolize all like the prisoners talking at once.
Yeah, just how hated he is because he put all these guys away.
But I just think it's a really good like choice, like textual choice to put all the speech bubbles together to emphasize them all talking at once. And again, just the lighting. This whole, even though it's just a page, like the lighting really like comes off in this chapter.
Yeah, and it's still colorful.
Yeah,
Remember that? Like
it still is.
it's not all black and gray. Like there's still vibrant colors here that display dark moods, which I very much respect.
Right. So then we get another flashback of him as a child being teased, and him taking like a bully cigarette and almost burning his eye out. The birth of a psychopath, I guess.
So then we see the first instance of Malcolm with his wife, and we think it's like this. We're led to believe they have this healthy, intimate relationship, but as this chapter goes
Mhm.
on, it only gets worse.
It's funny because I recently just watched Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf for the first time,
Oh shit!
and it's kind of the same thing. Like they start off seeing like they have a fine relationship, but as it just goes on and on and on, it just gets more and more hard to watch.
We get the next therapy session where Walter says, "I don't like you."
Yeah, you keep calling me Walter. I don't like you. Again, going back to the doctor just being naive.
Yeah,
Just being like, "Oh, Walter, why don't you tell me about Rorschach?"
he has the goofiest face too when he's told that he doesn't like him
Yeah,
with that
it's almost like he's scared.
like with the bow tie and his fat cheeks and everything. He just looks very silly.
So Kovac starts telling the doctor about how Rorschach came to be.
And I think it's interesting how of course, considering his views on women, he didn't like his job handling women's clothing. Yet he makes his mask out of a dress to cover up his face and give him a face he can stand to look at, as he says.
Right.
So, do you think there's some gender dysphoria going on here?
Maybe there could very well be some.
If he makes his face out of literally women's clothing, I think there's very much something going on here.
I get because they make it like his Rorschach mask, like his face keeps moving and such. Does that still? I don't know if I caught this, but does that happen on the dress too, or does he like make it that way?
No, it's that way on the dress too, because it's a Manhattan material. And we get this scene where finds out the woman who initially bought the dress is raped and killed, and people just watch.
Yeah.
Just they don't do anything to stop it. They just look at the perverse spectacle of it.
It's interesting. I took home the remains of her unwanted dress and made a face that I could bear to look at in the mirror.
Yeah, something going on here because there's no way he would say that if he was comfortable with being a man.
But then again, I never. Again, this is the first time I'm being told all this because again, I've never really heard that interpretation.
I mean, I know I come from a place of bias considering who I am, but
Yeah.
that's how I see it.
Yeah, I can see why you see that. So it goes back and Rorschach pretty much tells him like, why are you spending time with me? There's a lot of other people that are worse than I am, but then again, they're not famous.
Yep.
You don't want to make me well, just want to know what makes me sick. And as he leaves, he just says, "You'll find out. Have patience, you'll find out."
So then we get this scene where the inmates are trying to kill him. Yet Rorschach stops it by taking a French fry, like grease fryer, and just throwing it at a guy's face.
And that guy ends up dying from his burns.
Yep.
And that leads to the famous line where, as they dragged him away, Rorschach spoke to the other inmates and said, None of you understand. I'm not locked up in here with you. You're locked up in here with me. Again, it's this like scrawny guy, but damn, he's so intimidating.
Yeah, don't underestimate him.
Definitely. And then we get to the next scene of Malcolm and his wife.
Yeah, and we see that, remember last night, Mal, when I required attention, shows that even then he couldn't get it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just shows this case is already having a toll on him and the relationship.
Yeah, well, the wife just kind of wants his sex, but he's too busy with his work.
Yeah. But even last night when they tried to have sex, he couldn't get it up.
Yeah, that's true.
This
And I
having
find it,
a toll on his psychology.
mm-hmm. And the last page is him going back with "You're locked up in here with me," and he's like, he's right. He's absolutely right. Which again alludes to now he's totally obsessed with his work, just trying to figure out what happened to this guy.
Yeah, and he starts calling him Rorschach and not Walter.
Right. Like nobody in the prison, at least the prisoners don't call him like Walter. Everyone seems to just call him Rorschach.
Yeah, that's who he is at this point.
Pretty much.
So then we see Rorschach's like upbringings in vigilantism, and he's not Rorschach yet. He's very much like really not that far off from any other like 40s or like Silver Age private dick character. A
Yeah.
lot of question as we see in these panels.
Yeah. He even says so himself. I wasn't Rorschach then. I was just Kovacs. Kovacs pretending to be Rorschach. And he talks about he was quote unquote very soft on the people he like captured and he let them live. Like he was Spider-Man.
Right, and like it's not that far off from a Silver Age character. It's not until we get to a specific case to where he completely snaps.
Yeah. And he even says that about all his friends, like all the people I knew, they were all soft. While it shows him like shaking hands with Dan, who we know is also a very soft person.
Yeah.
So he talks about them teaming up with Night Owl, and they're a good team until he quit. And then he talks about what he thought about the comedian.
Yeah, because we already know he admires this guy. Before he could learn about the Roche incident. Malcolm Logg's already starting to have disturbing commentary about the world, like saying like the not top silhouette reminds him of the Hiroshima blast.
Right.
And he's starting to talk to his wife even less.
Yeah, because he's now getting so obsessed with this.
Mm-hmm.
So then we get to the last interrogation where he talks about how a Rorschach test reminds him of a dog with a head split in half.
Yeah, not a butterfly at all.
Which again, we know he thinks that because the first time he sees that, it cuts to the dog head and he just says a butterfly. So we know he's thinking that.
Yeah. Now we see it in action. This is where we get to see the Roche case that really snapped him.
And where he actually became Rorschach.
Right.
Again, so he talks about how there was a kidnapping case and he was sent to investigate. And pretty much for the next couple of chapters, there's barely any dialogue. Which, again, this might be one of the top 5 best examples of this in the entire book.
Because these poor dogs were fed a little girl, Rorschach just fucking kills them.
Yeah, he takes a butcher knife and just slashes them on the head.
And
this is where Rorschach was born, because he says it was Kovacs who said mother, then muffled under latex. It was Kovacs who closed his eyes. It was Rorschach who opened them again.
God, yeah, it's pretty disturbing.
Yeah, so he basically takes the dogs of the guy who killed the girl and basically throws them at the window. So Rorschach comes, he handcuffs him to like a pipe, and then he lights the whole apartment on fire.
Yes.
And he just watches.
Yeah, nobody got out. He watched it for hours.
The fact that his mother was brutally murdered and all Rorschach said was good.
And I'll say
I found that just to be it.
And when you see in the Roche scene, when the dog's blood is splattered all over his coat, that stain never goes away. Yeah, you always see remnants
No,
of
that
that
stays there for the entire rest of the scene.
rest of this book. Yeah.
Just really gives you a good idea of just how far gone Rorschach really is.
Yeah, and
Also notice how going back to when Walter Kovacs is talking, his speech bubbles are normal.
because he's not under a mask.
Exactly. But even before then, the scene with the crime busters and Rorschach's speech bubbles are normal.
That also showed he was
So
normal.
yeah, so technically speaking, because in the first time in this one, we talked to the guy who killed the girl. His 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 speech bubbles are all scraggly, which I like to think that's the first time, like chronologically, that would happen in the comic.
So then we get this last scene with Malcolm, and his monologue is even more disturbing than it was before. And his interactions with his peers are very blunt and very
Mhm.
violent when he's upsetting everybody around him. And at this point, he's just given up on the world, despite being such an optimistic
Yeah,
guy at the start of this chapter.
yeah, because like he's talking about how he told him about the girl kidnapped, and the guy just jokingly says like, "Oh, what do they do? Like gag her and stuff?" And he just goes, "No, they abducted her and fed her to the dogs," and everyone just goes silent.
Yeah.
And then Gloria leaves the table, and they argue.
Yeah. So yeah, I feel like the stuff with the doctor is the real bread and butter of this chapter because it really goes into the psychology of this whole thing. And that's where the quote comes from, because it's Nietzsche saying, "Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you." That,
Right.
that makes it more interesting than if it was just
Again, I just feel like yeah, the Doctor adds like a completely like insight into like Rorschach as a character, and also just like those kinds of people in general.
yeah.
And after that, they just have they just give like police papers and psychiatric.
Oh, I will say about those the Charlton home where he goes from, where he was when he was a kid. It's called Charlton Home because all of these all of these characters are based off
Right.
characters from Charlton comics.
Really?
Yeah,
Yeah, I get it.
yeah,
That's
that's
pretty cool.
yeah. And so we get these letters from young Walter saying that even though he's never met his dad, he admires him. And because of that, he admires President Truman, saying it was a good thing to drop the bomb on Japan.
Yeah.
Yet, when we get to 11-2 towards the end, his reaction to that is very hypocritical considering how he feels about this.
Which I think we revealed before that Rorschach is a very hypocritical character.
Very much so. And
Right.
he talks about this nightmare he has with the silhouette as like this Siamese monster. Shows like his fear of sex happening at a very young age. So yeah,
Right.
good
So is there anything
chapter.
yes, it is.
Good
Do you have anything
chapter.
else to say about it?
Yeah, my only real beef with this chapter is that I don't think it does enough to criticize Rorschach's worldview. Because compared to like Comedian or Dr. Manhattan or Ozymandias later on, I feel like those chapters very much do enough to criticize their viewpoints, while this one almost frames him as if he's correct.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of a failure on its part. That's my
Yeah,
only
like
real
a lot of these chapters, I feel like its main goal is like to show how he became who he is.
yeah, which is
And
fine.
there's not really that much insight to that, so right?
Which is fine, but I feel like this chapter is why some people view Rorschach as the hero of this book. When if Alan Moore was not intending to do that, then he failed. I feel.
Including Zack Snyder.
Yep, we'll get into that. So yeah, we're halfway through the book. Really great stuff we're getting at. And I look forward to talking about next week when we do chapters 7 through 9. See you next week. Bye.
All right, bye.